You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Now, you know I like sci-fi, and you know I like talking about future conflict. But how can you actually understand future conflict through sci-fi? We've done interviews with people before. We've talked about useful fiction or fiction intelligence. But the actual understanding, inculcation of science fiction into a cultural approach to the future conflict of war is something we haven't approached. Why? Because I didn't really understand that you could approach things like that. G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. Thank you so much for your reviews on iTunes. There are a few people I need to explain the concept of a backhanded compliment to. Thank you very much for your 5 stars. If you want to say some negative things, feel free, but if you give me 5 stars, like one of our recent reviewers, I'm happy to take any criticism with those 5 stars alongside it. Now, also, those people who are having issues with the audio, please send me an email at deadprussian@gmail.com and let me know the audio issues. I'm really interested to find out what platforms you're listening to the audio on, because if I'm getting it from a lot of listeners, it'll be something very, very specific to the episode, but sometimes it might actually be the platform you're listening to it, and I can help you work out your sound settings. Now, my guest today is Lieutenant Colonel David Calder. He's currently studying on the United Kingdom's Advanced and Command Staff course. He is also a Chief of Defence Staff scholar, and he's undertaking a Masters by Research in Defence Studies with great friends of the show, King's College London. This research is exploring how science fiction can be used to change military perspectives. He's an armoured engineer. That's his role. He's not actually walking around in armour. And he's deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Estonia in recent years. David, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks very much, and I really appreciate the chance to talk about the research. It's been an amazing year to be given the time to fuse, I sort of call it, bringing my passion and my profession together, and do something with it. And I think what I've managed to get to by the end of this year is something that's quite useful. But it's been a blast doing it at the same time, which is, I guess, what makes really good academic, or good from a personal point of view, academic study really worthwhile.
Yeah, now, David, we are always inclined to support people in their passions, but it's got to be within reason. There's a few weirdos out there we will not support in their predilections. Now, David, before we start discussing your research, I'm actually keen to find out how you got interested in getting this off the ground. How did you propose a research project on science fiction and war?
So it was one of the things I wanted to do something different, and what we had was the birth of this new program, which is a pilot this year of doing a Masters by Research, which is the first time King's College have run this in the Defence Academy. And what happened was that our Chief of Defence Staff set 6 criteria that we could write against, and one of those was challenge. And to be honest, I wanted to do something with science fiction before the course, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. And the way the course is structured with additional supervision, we get a 3-star mentor as well, and some extra time off. And some of the modules that we would have to do in the normal MA, we don't have to do, and effectively we trade those things. So it seemed all in a win for me, and worked really well for me personally. Now, the thing I really was conscious of was that science fiction has an enormous fandom, and it is a popular culture form of media, or medias, and so absolutely nailing the academic value behind it was the first thing I had to do, and that was really laying that out in the proposal and putting together a hypothesis that would show that I think there's a link between what science fiction does in imagining things and what we do in terms of actually applying that to military thinking and how we challenge the things that we think are right that may not be right.
And it's quite, I guess you're quite lucky actually, because it's quite a forward-thinking organisation. It's not always used for militaries, actually, the term forward-thinking organisations, but it's quite a forward-thinking organisation that would support a proposal like this. And in your writing, you actually talk about a few, like you use terminology that for those listeners out there that are hoping to read David's research and just read about Starbuck and Cylons, it's not actually how it works. You use some very, very specific concepts, and you talk about establishing critical utility. This was the first one that sort of struck me as interesting. What does this term mean?
So I sort of took critical utility as, because linking it back to that challenge that we're trying to provide, so to take how we think in the military at the moment and come at it from a completely different point of view. And over the last couple of years, we've started to explore that in terms of red teaming, so taking people out of normal planning processes and come at a problem from a completely different direction. It was kind of the same thing that I want to do here, and so it links, and critical utility is linked directly to critical thinking, which is it's an academic skill that we're drilled pretty hard with. Well, I say drilled, that's completely the wrong term. We are given the tools to understand how to do that, and to make sure that, and it all comes out of our experience of the planning for the Iraq War in particular, and also for Afghanistan, and the Chilcot report, which came out a couple of years ago, which really has caused us to think about how we overcome things like bias, groupthink, and making sure we're doing really good evidence-based decision making and challenging that evidence and asking the right questions about it. So what I wanted to do was use this form of critical thinking, which I pretty strongly believed could be delivered through something like science fiction, to then bring it in to question the nature and character of the world that we see at the moment. And it's based on a lot of thinking. So a guy called Carl Friedman, not to be confused with Lawrence Friedman, brings this idea that critical thinking is absolutely part of science fiction in terms of the theoretical basis of where it comes from. And as you sort of unwrap the layers of how you define science fiction, what science fiction actually is, you get into ideas from like Darko Suvin about cognitive estrangement, and that estrangement part, which comes from sort of Brecht, and then you're into sort of Marxist thinking, and then you're right back to people like Hegel, and then suddenly you're at the roots of this tree, this theoretical tree, which serves all the same sort of stuff as our international relations theory. So there's this common sort of ontological basis, or the theoretical basis, to understand how we can use science fiction in a way that isn't just for escapism. It isn't just for imagining what the future might be. And once you start getting into that, it opens up some really interesting opportunities with how you can use it.
It's interesting you went through a heap of philosophers. I've probably got no idea who they are, but my favourite word you used was Brecht. It's just a good word. Makes me think Carl would have liked it. So that's a good word. So establishing critical utility is interesting, but you also touch on, here we go. This is probably going to be my biggest string of impressive words for the interview. You touch on science fiction's contribution to socio-technical critique. Boom, nailed it. Now, what is this contribution to socio-technical critique?
So, I mean, one of the things about I was really sort of wrestling with was, what makes science fiction unique? Why doesn't all literature do this, or all just regular thinking do this in terms of being able to look at who we are, our relationship with technology in particular, to be able to start teasing it apart. And in sort of doing the research, it became pretty clear. And I mean, now I reflect on it, it's pretty obvious that science fiction's it's three things that I see. It's an art form, absolutely. It's about imagination. It's scientifically speculative, it can be, but it's also inherently social. And there are a lot of people who talk about, science fiction comes from, it's often not about the future, it's about our present and about our history. And so it becomes of a society. It reflects who is writing it and their biases and the situation they're in. And so what you are then able to do is then use those sort of ideas to start considering things like technology as not just things, but they're objects, they're political and social objects. And there was a lot of thinking back in the 70s and 80s on particularly things like nuclear weapons, that it's not actually the bomb itself which is important, and this plays into deterrence theory and all that good stuff, but it's about their political and social value, and how that value that they hold can actually form part of what shapes our future. And what science fiction does is that it pulls together all those interdependencies across an artistic world, across the scientific world, and social sciences, to be able to really start interrogating what these things mean to us. And when you look into the future, how you can, what you need to be looking out for. It's not just the technology in itself that is important. It's all those other factors that play into it. And so especially when we talk about how militaries adapt to these things, what are the things that we need to be looking out for, as things like artificial intelligence or human enhancement start coming online.
Yeah, the Cylons are coming.
Yeah.
So that's all I got from that, listeners, was that David said we have to watch out for the Cylons. No, but David, it's very, very interesting how you can take something so... most people, I think, not necessarily those who listen to this show, but most people on the street would say you're using Doctor Who to plan the future war. That is bonkers, but that's okay, because those people who are walking down the street and talk to you about Doctor Who are bonkers. Now, you explore, this is another very impressive term I'm going to use here, listeners, but it's not mine. You explore self-fulfilling dynamics to achieve military advantage. Now, that sounds absolutely brilliant, but I don't actually understand what it is. My interpretation is this about what is going to be science fiction and what's going to be science fact?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. So, well, one of the things, and it was kind of a trope that I kept on coming across when you read about science fiction, that a lot of the technology that we have today was born out of Star Trek or Back to the Future. You could list 1,000 sci-fi references for all the stuff we have around us today, and so that kind of sparked in me as well. Is there this kind of, if people write about it, does it come true?
Yeah,
and obviously not everything that's going to be written about does come true, but there seems to be something there. So that was the self-fulfilling dynamic of it. And the more I looked into that, it wasn't quite right. And there were sort of three issues that I found with it. Firstly, it's factual, that actually what we see in science fiction never actually really comes into being for exactly how it was envisaged. So like the hoverboards you can buy in a toy shop now are not like Marty McFly's hoverboard. You'd be pretty disappointed in it.
I am disappointed.
Also, we can use, or science fiction is used quite a lot to explain really complex scientific concepts. So there's a lot on sort of quantum gate technology that people say, oh well, this is the transporters from Star Trek. It's like, no, it's not. It's so far away from that. But it gives people the in, and there's maybe a bit in there about how you can justify research funding and popularize the science you're doing. But it does make it means you have to really contextualize these sort of assertions.
Yeah.
And then the last bit is intention. And a lot of the time, science fiction writers don't think that the things that they're writing about are, they're not necessarily wanting these things to come true. They're just they're just good narrative devices to move a story along. So in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the actual Hitchhiker's Guide, which is like an iPad that
It's basically an iPad. Yep.
Yeah. And Douglas Adams was asked, well, how do you feel about being the inventor of this? And he was like, it's ridiculous. It was literally just to keep my story going.
Yeah.
But what that doesn't account for is that it can clearly inspire people. And people can take ideas from science fiction and then they become a thing. And it's not just technology. There's quite a lot in terms of our social and political thinking as well. And you can take that back to H.G. Wells and some of the amazing stuff that he did. He's a personal hero of mine. Of somebody who was just in the right place at the right time, was thinking about the right things that had traction, and he made them happen as not as a one man, but he was part of a really big part of that wider conversation to set up things like the League of Nations, which didn't go so well, but drafting the UN Convention on Human Rights, which we still put so much stock in today.
He's one of those guys. H.G. Wells is one of those guys that comes up all the time, and I'm sure he's quite happy with that because, I guess his royalties mean nothing to him right now. But I'm sure he's somewhere just going, I called it. Yeah. The good news is he weaponized germ warfare for the common cold. So, thanks, H.G., for giving us those sorts of great ideas. Now, finally, you've actually focused on a particular nation's science fiction in your research. So you explored Chinese science fiction and the Chinese science fiction tradition of, I think I've read one Chinese science fiction novel. I think that was The Three-Body Problem, and I'm about to start another one. So why did you choose, and don't get me wrong, Three-Body Problem I found enjoyable in the end, found it very busy in the middle, but that's nothing against the Chinese writer. I'll just blame the translator. But why did you choose Chinese science fiction?
So part of it was because clearly I'm a military student, and that this is a thing being paid for, and I'm being given a year to study it. So I did want to try and bring back some applicability to what I was doing. Yeah. The other bit was, so this idea of critical utility, which I talked about a minute ago, I saw no reason why that couldn't be applied to a completely alien culture to our own. So while most science fiction that we interact with will be, UK or American or from that Western tradition, that actually where people have started to write sci-fi in other cultures, or that you could apply the same principles to it. And when I sort of said that, we can get ideas about it reflects society, that if you could analyze that science fiction, you might just start to get a better understanding of the cultural factors behind some of the decisions that people make, and what's driving a nation to do what they do, or a culture to do what they do. China's fairly sort of closed in that way, in that you can broadly say that the science fiction that's published in China might reflect that cultural understanding and thinking. So that's what I wanted to do, and it was that there are a few academics that have worked on it, which I had to lean on quite heavily, but it was also just a really fascinating thing to get into, and really enjoyable too.
I know Chinese strategic culture is quite interesting, fascinating in all ways, quite a interesting debate on how people take it. So I imagine this kind of nuanced look at those sorts of socio-cultural inputs would have been absolutely fantastic to spend some time doing. And what we're going to spend some time doing now is we're going to switch across to our bonus episode, a bonus lesson, bonus question. There you go, listeners. It is it's very late here in Australia, while it's very early where David is. But we're going to switch to the bonus question, which our subscribers will get, and everyone else, well, too bad, so sad. So we'll just switch over now. Now, David, my final question is one I ask of all guests. It relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. I ask each guest to finish the sentence war is. So, I ask you now, finish the sentence. War is.
War is what we make it. And this kind of gets to where I concluded about science fiction's role in prediction. I don't think it's particularly good at predicting the future. But what it does do is it can inspire us, and it shows that we have agency in defining what our future will be. And so I think when we look at future war, and this is my opinion, that we need to be less looking at predicting what will shape it and what will drive how we fight. And we should stop asking how we need to fight and start asking how do we want to fight, and define it in our own terms, and then strive towards that, which would be, I think, quite an interesting approach to take.
That's very, very interesting. It's quite bolshy as well, because David is not considering not fighting at all. So, all right, just don't go for a few pints with David, because you know where the night's going to end. Look, David, that's a great definition of war is, and I can probably fit that into a tweet, because Twitter, I think you get 7 million characters these days, so it should be fine. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Cheers.
And listeners, you can support David by do what I do. Follow him on Twitter. That's how I found his research. I found him on Twitter, and I was fascinated. So if you follow him on Twitter at DRJ Calder, that's CALDER 81, I think you'll be as impressed as I was. Also, click on our show notes. You'll find links to David's research at KCL through our show notes. Give it a read, because it is fascinating stuff. And if for nothing else, you get to drop terms like it's establishing your critical utility and contributions to socio-technical critique. Now, I'm not sure what sort of parties you go to, ladies and gents, but I drop them at the parties I go to. Boom. I'm the brain of the party. Not many people want to talk to me after that, so mission achieved. And also, thank you very much for your support on Patreon. Our legends keep the show running. We are doing very well on our transcription project. We have all of our episodes transcribed in rough draft form, and now we are going through finalising those. And then we will look at which way they will be published and put out there for people to access. Our legends on Patreon will get access to those on the Patreon platform. And those other listeners, if you want our transcripts, just keep your eye on this space. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.